Shalom, I'm Chris. Let's follow Jesus along the Talmidim way. Genesis chapter 39, we're continuing the story of Joseph, and this is the famous episode with Joseph and Potiphar's wife that's going to end up landing Joseph in jail for some time. We always want to remember Acts 17:11. These Bereans were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, for they received the word with great eagerness, examined the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. Translation, don't believe anything I tell you, don't believe anything you read. Always be a good Bible investigator and check things out for yourself. We are now going to be in the land of Egypt. When we last saw Joseph, he was sold by his brothers to some Ishmaelite traders, and so we had this interlude of chapter 38, and now chapter 39 is going to begin with the fact that Joseph was brought to Egypt by the Ishmaelites. So we have this kind of tie-in. Back in the land of Dothan, his brothers took a fancy garment. They stained it with the blood of a kid goat, another deception theme running through Genesis, and then they presented it to their father Jacob. And they have this. I don't know whose this is. Maybe I don't know. Have you seen it before? And so obviously everyone knows, including the brothers. They know that it's Joseph's, and the brothers know that Joseph is not dead, but Jacob logically assumes that Joseph has been killed. The reader, however, knows, even the brothers don't know this, that he's been taken to Egypt and he is working as an enslaved person in Potiphar's house. As we move through this study, one thing we want to look for is parallels with Joseph as he foreshadows the many attributes of Jesus, the Messiah. I'll do a recap at the end of this chapter to call out a few of these that we just see directly in this chapter, but as we read the story of Joseph, we're going to want to see all of those parallels. There are many, hundreds of them, in fact. There are also some interesting tie-ins and contrast to chapter 38. It seems like it's abruptly inserted, but we're going to be contrasting Joseph's moral standard compared to his brother's Judah's, and then we're going to contrast Potiphar's wife, who behaves quite differently than Tamar, who was described as righteous. Verse 1, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. Joseph's suffering really foreshadows the suffering of the nation and the suffering of Messiah, and we'll pick that up in a moment. As we noted previously, there's a lot of tie-in with chapter 38. It's subtle, but if you're looking for it, you can see it. Chapter 38, verse 1 literally says, and it came about that Judah went down from his brothers. Chapter 39 begins, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Judah descended spiritually into bondage, and Joseph is descending literally into bondage. Pharaoh means great house, and so it's a title and not a personal name. There's going to be lots of different pharaohs as we move through the scriptures. And again, we have the note about the Ishmaelites reminding us that we are resuming the narrative from chapter 37. There are several things interesting about this chapter, and one of those is the repetition that is over and over. You see the same words repeated and often restated. So here in verse 1, the divine narrator he tells us the first of 3 times that Potiphar is an Egyptian. And after already telling us that Joseph was taken to Egypt, verses 2 and verse 5 are the other times. The sages, of course, ask, why is all of this repetition of Egyptian necessary? We have to remember that when the Torah was written, the descent of the nation and deliverance of the nation to and from Egypt they're already looking back on that. So basically, this is emphasizing the fact that they were in Egypt, and this is all foreshadowing what's about to happen to the nation. So some see it as drawing the reader's attention back to Genesis 15:3, and God said to Abram, "For you know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years." And so basically, in a sense, this is fulfillment, because it starts with Joseph's descent into Egypt, and he becomes a slave person. He'll eventually rise up out of that, but then the people will come down, his family, and they will depart a nation after they've been enslaved by Pharaoh. And the Lord was with Joseph, and so he became a successful man and was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did prosper in his hand. Watch that phrase. It'll reappear again at the end of the chapter. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and he became his personal servant and made him overseer over his house and put him in charge of all that he owned. So this Lord was with Joseph and became a successful man. This really could be a one-sentence summary of the entire life of Joseph. That's would that this could be said about all of this, because if the Lord is with us, we will, by definition, become successful. It's interesting that a non-believer saw this. The non-believer saw that the Lord was with Joseph. So let us reflect on that. It says his master saw. And so I think what would be the natural tendency would be to complain about the betrayal and rejection by his brothers. And we might even say that Joseph had every right to do this. But instead, Joseph focused on being a diligent steward and a faithful representative of God. And that's really important. Jesus has several parables in different flavors about diligent and lazy servants, and in one parable, it's about the five bridesmaids who were lazy and the five bridesmaids who were diligent. There's a couple in Matthew 25 and Luke 17 where the master he's going on a journey, he leaves his servants in charge, comes back entirely unannounced and unexpected, and then demands an accounting. Well, if that happened to Joseph, Joseph would be found blessing and in favor. And if you remember those parables, the stewards and the servants who did well and grew the investment, they were given even more responsibility and more blessings. And so in all of this can be a parallel of the blessings that we get when we are diligent and we are faithful servants. And even more so, Jesus has blessings bestowed from his Father as well. So all of this is paralleling that types of examples for us on being a faithful servant. And it came about from the time that he made him an overseer in his house and over all that he owned. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. There's that Egyptian again. So the Lord's blessing was upon all he owned in the house and in the field. So he left Joseph in charge of everything that he owned. And with him there, he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. Kind of curious statement there. Now, Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. So all that in a bag of chips. Joseph had it all. He was really the complete package there. So Joseph had the Lord's blessing, and that the Egyptian left Joseph in charge of everything is repeated here. And again, we just want to take note of that. It's interesting, this focus on repetition here. We call this the story of Joseph, but read this chapter from beginning to end and notice who really is the focus. It's the Lord that is the focus all the way through, not just this chapter, but through the entire story of Joseph. Joseph is really pointing everyone involved to the Lord and the Lord's goodness. So this food he ate is quite interesting. This is a subtle hint that although the kosher laws were yet to be codified, Moses hadn't happened yet, the Torah hadn't been delivered yet, Joseph already apparently had different dietary standards than the Egyptians. And we know many of God's laws do date well before the time of Moses. Adam and Eve were taught to observe the Sabbath, and Noah already knew which animals were clean and unclean. I'm assuming that Adam and Eve were taught all of this, and then they passed it down, and then Moses codified it in the Torah. And it's interesting that in Genesis 43, we're going to see that it was the Egyptians who found the Hebrews unclean. But I'm sure the feeling was mutual. They didn't want to have anything to do with each other. They didn't dine with these foreigners. They kept their distance. And this is going to be a problem that continues all the way through the early church. Peter's going to have some issues of who I can eat with. Clean eating is a big, big deal in the ancient world, much more so than it is today. And it came about after these events that his master's wife had her eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Sleep with me." All right, here we go. This is the main tension in the chapter, and not very subtle, very direct. What is interesting here is that it says, and it came about after these events. That is in Hebrew, the exact same phrase as Genesis 22. Now, it came about after these things that God tested Abraham. And in Hebrew, you'd say, Vayahi acher hadavarim ha'ela. These things have come to pass. So the Torah here is giving us a clue that these two tests of character one for Joseph and one for Abraham, are related. God is testing their faithfulness to see how they do. One possible interpretation of the verse in the Lord's Prayer that we know as "Lead me not into temptation, but lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil," might be, "Do not bring us into the hands of a test like Joseph and Abraham, but if I am tested, let me be delivered like Joseph and Abraham." James 1:13 reminds us that the Lord himself does not tempt us to sin. We have plenty of power to do that on our own. But the Lord will test our character and our faithfulness from time to time. And we can have this opportunity to either indulge in sin or back away, just like Joseph did. An indication of the disdain that the Bible has for Potiphar's wife. It doesn't even record her name here through any of this. We don't know her name. It just says his master's wife over and over again. Later we'll see this name Potiphar, and many assume that Potiphar is Potiphar's wife. That's actually not the case. We have to go to Genesis 41:45. Potiphar is actually a male, so Potiphar becomes Joseph's father-in-law. So not the same person. So keep that in mind. This woman is unnamed for a very specific reason. There's an Egyptian legend. It's called the Tale of Two Brothers, and it has this identical plot line, except instead of a master-servant relationship, it's two brothers, and one who is single and faithful, and the other is married and has this wayward wife. It does date to the 12th century BC, which is well after the date of Joseph. And so the question is, did the story of Joseph influence this very larger and well-published Egyptian version? The story is the same. It's a plot of false accusation of an attempted rape by the woman's brother-in-law. But after this, the stories are not a whole lot similar, but it's just there's some parallels, which is kind of interesting. But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look with me here. My master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put me in charge of all that he owns. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin, not against Potiphar, but sin against God?" And that's a question he poses to her. Though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her or lie beside her or be with her. And so this is definitely contrasted with Judah's and even his son's moral failings that we read in the previous chapter. So we're having this comparing and contrast here. And we've got Potiphar's wife contrasted with Tamar, and Tamar was righteous, and Potiphar's wife is clearly not that way. One suggestion is that Joseph knew from his family that the sexually immoral forfeited their inheritance. So Ishmael, Esau, and Reuben were all in a position to receive an inheritance, but each forfeited because of a sexual misconduct. Esau had other things going on, but it also included his taking Canaanite wives, which was something he wasn't supposed to do. As an additional wrinkle, some suggest that Potiphar might have been a eunuch. And so if true, we don't know that for sure, although some translations say he was a eunuch. This might provide some additional backstory to his wife's actions. Not to excuse them, but to at least we have some additional flavor as to the story. I love this phrase, "How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" When we are about to make a decision to sin, or hopefully not to sin, we need to remember that our sin would truly be against God. Joseph doesn't say that he would betray the trust of his master or would, she'd be breaking her marriage vows. He clearly says, I would be sinning against God. And it reminds me of David after he was confronted by his sin with Bathsheba. He wrote Psalm 51, and he writes, "Against you and you alone I have sinned and done what is evil in your sight." And so we just have this pattern of, we need to remember when we sin and when we fail, we're making our own lives harder, but we're also in some sense, damaging our spiritual walk as well. And we need to remember that, of course, we have forgiveness, but grace is not cheap, and we shouldn't treat it like that. I love the fact that God is always on Joseph's lips, and I think that's because God was always in the center of his heart. So out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, and Joseph is always redirecting his focus from himself back towards God. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the people of the household were inside. Now, got a problem here. So she grabbed him by his garment, saying, "Sleep with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. So there were repeated advances. This isn't a one-time thing. And so many single men would have, I'm sure, had a lot of trouble resisting, especially when you're all alone. No one else is going to know. 1 Corinthians 10:13, no temptation has overtaken you except something common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able. But with the temptation, will provide a way of escape so that you will be able to endure it. Very important verse. When we sin, it's not because the devil made me do it. It's because we chose to fall into that temptation and give in and forget that we are representatives of God and our behavior has to be on a different standard. Very critical point here. He left his garment in her hand. So just as with the episode with Joseph's brothers, this garment likely included Joseph's status and rank. Anyone who found it could have easily identified Joseph as the owner. So again, the garment becomes this the symbol of jealousy and mistreatment and deception. And this is kind of all happening all again. And, Joseph has to be wondering, why me? What did I do? But he's faithful to the end. Again, also a compare and contrast. Remember from chapter 38, Tamar kept Judah's garments as evidence against him, just as Potiphar's wife does here. Of course, Tamar has righteous motives where this woman is intending to deceive. Repeated again in verse 15, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought a Hebrew to make fun of us, and he came in to sleep with me, and I screamed. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment, where? Not in her hand, beside me, and fled and went outside." And so again, we have a repetition of verse 13, repeating verse 12, and she's making this lie about how the garment came to be in her possession. Had she let it slip that it was in her hand at the time Joseph fled, then her story would have lost all credibility, because what was she doing holding onto his garment as he's getting away? The whole nature of the story changes when we just tell this little bit of a half-truth, and that's what she did here, and she spun it completely. She names neither her husband nor Joseph, so I always find it fascinating when we know people's names, but in the narration, the way it comes to us, the names are omitted, and I just think it's curious there. This word "made fun of us," if you're keeping score at home, you guessed it, it's related to the word sahak, the word used in Genesis 26 when Abraham witnessed Isaac and Rebekah sahaking, and Isaac's name is related to the same word, Yitzhak. And again, I'm bringing this up because this is a clue to what was going on in Genesis 21. Ishmael was sahaking with Isaac, and our translations put it mildly and say he was making fun of Isaac, but we know there's more things going on here. There's definitely a sexual connotation here. So again, she skillfully has to lie about how this garment came into her possession. And again, the story of the Joseph's garment is being repeated over again. 1 Corinthians says to flee sexual immorality. With other types of sins, we can stand firm and withstand it. But with sexual sin, Paul has a completely opposite approach. Flee sexual immorality. Every other sin that a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. So he takes a hard stance against sexual immorality throughout his letters. There's lots of verses that we could have cited. But we're told the reason if we continue reading this 1 Corinthians passage. Verse 19, "Do you not know your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, with whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? You have been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body." So we tend to think our bodies are mine, what I do is my business, but that is not the case. We have been purchased with a price. Always important to remember that. Potiphar's wife continues, "So she left his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words," again, repeated, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came in to me to make fun of me. But when I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside. Now, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, "This is what your slave did to me," his anger burned. Very interesting. The Hebrew does not indicate at whom Potiphar's anger burned. And the most obvious explanation, and the one many commentators take, was that he is mad at Joseph. But there's something very curious that Potiphar's about to do in the next verse. So let's take a look. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. And now you're probably going, so what? We know the story. Joseph was in prison. Several commentators suggest that Potiphar was not fully convinced his wife was being truthful. The reason is Potiphar would have had the authority to put a rapist and a potential rapist to death instantly. He could have done it right there, snapped his fingers. So we need to question why he doesn't hear, and that's a question we want to probe. Chuck Missler suggested that his anger burned not at Joseph, but his anger burned at his wife, because he probably had an inkling of what kind of person she was, and then now she has accused his most loyal and dependable servant. If he knows Joseph's character, this is entirely out of character. Potiphar knows this, but being a politician, he has to save face. So instead of putting Joseph to death, he sends him to prison and kind of spares his life that way. He probably, according to this view, he wasn't happy about being put in the situation, so his anger really burned directed to his wife and not Joseph. Now, as a Berean, I'm not saying that's right, but as a Berean, we want to make sure to consider all angles, and this one has a lot of merit. And Walton actually, in his background commentary, echoes the sentiment that Potiphar may have understood exactly what happened, and Joseph was not to blame in this at all. We're going to learn in the next chapter that this is not just any prison, but one that's reserved for royal prisoners. Now, Psalms does make a comment that Joseph was put in shackles, but perhaps this is the type of prison where everyone is innocent. And so it's political prisoners that are here and people that they want to just get out of scene because they're inconvenient. In any case, as Walton notes, it may have been a bit more comfortable than the average prison as prisons go. In one sense, to Joseph, it didn't matter where he was physically, because wherever he was, whether it was a pit or in jail, he knows that God is with him, and that's the important lesson. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the warden of the prison. So again, Joseph's character comes through all this. The warden of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison, so that whatever was done there, Joseph, he was responsible for it. The warden of the prison did not supervise anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made whatever he did prosper. So there's this verse again, the almost identical to Potiphar giving Joseph all this authority. We now have the prison warden doing the same thing. Joseph never seemed to take God's blessing and favor for granted. He was always there displaying commitment and loyalty to his Lord. Lancaster, in his commentary, mentions a parable where a wealthy benefactor anonymously gave $1,000 every week to a certain person. So, of course, the man was grateful for the repeated gifts, but as time went on, human nature took over, right? He began to act as if he were then entitled to the weekly check. And when this happened, the donor cut the money supply off, and the former recipient now became angry that what was his had been taken away. And so isn't that just like human nature, that we see things as an entitlement? Joseph never had this mindset with God's blessings. We no matter what situation that we find ourselves in, we should be praising God and causing others around us to marvel at, no matter our circumstances, we are praising the Lord no matter what. This chapter 39 began by telling us in verse 2 that the Lord was with Joseph, and we have the same theme repeated here at the end. The Lord was with him, and the Lord made whatever he did prosper. This is that literary technique that's called inclusio, and this is bookending a passage using the same or similar phrasing. So it's setting this chapter off as something very special by reiterating and repeating all of these themes here. So, relatively short chapter. Let's go ahead and look at these messianic parallels, and I'll just go in chapter order, and I'll read some of the New Testament references. I won't necessarily read the verses in the interest of time. But so first we have Joseph in Egypt, and that's a type of the world, verse 1. Matthew chapter 2, we're told that Jesus has the flight to Egypt. Next, Joseph becomes a servant. Philippians 2, 6 and 7 talk about Jesus emptying himself and becoming a servant, and even becoming a bondservant. Next, Joseph prospers as a servant. Isaiah 52:13 says exactly this: "Behold, my servant will prosper." This is the suffering servant passage in Isaiah 52 and 53. His master was well pleased with him. That phrase should ring in our ears at Jesus' baptism. "This is my beloved son with whom I am well pleased." Joseph in verse 5 was made a blessing for others. Ephesians 1:3 says he has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. Verse 6 of 39, he was a godly person that was well favored. Luke 4 tells us that all the people in Nazareth were speaking well of him and admiring his gracious word. So another parallel here. He was sorely tempted and yet sinned not. Luke 4 talks about the temptation of Jesus, that he withstood and always refuted the temptations with Scripture. Hebrews 4:15 says, "We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in all things, just as we are, yet without sin." There's an interesting discussion as whether Jesus was able not to sin or he was not able to sin. And I like to think he was not able to sin, but yet we are told he identifies with us. And it doesn't really matter which one's true. It's an interesting discussion, but he withstood all of this because he's God and fully man. In 16 through 19 of this chapter, Joseph was falsely accused. We see this at the end. Matthew 26, the entire council kept trying to obtain false testimony. They finally found the two guys who would, bear false witness about Jesus. Next, he wasn't given the chance, and if he did, he kept his mouth shut anyway. He did not present a defense, just like Jesus did. Matthew 26:63, we're told he opened not his mouth. Joseph was cast into prison without a verdict. John 18:30, same thing. In fact, the temple leaders say, if he were innocent, we would not have handed him over to you. So, presumed guilty. Joseph suffers, although he was innocent. He suffers at the hands of Gentiles. We know that Jesus was whipped and mistreated by Romans. Ultimately, he won the respect of his jailer. And if we consider the Romans to be his jailers, he was under arrest at a certain time. And on the cross, Luke 23:47, we have a centurion proclaiming Jesus as innocent. So all of these parallels, this is just in this chapter. We'll have a lot more as we work through the next chapter. One thing I think is application for us is we remember James 1:12. "Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive a crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him." So let's all make sure we get our crowns. We don't grumble when bad things happen to us. I know it's natural, all of us do it, but let's try to remember this story and do better the next time we're facing adverse circumstances, and we just remember the life of Joseph. So next time, we're going to have more messianic parallels. These are going to be even more obvious this time because we've got the baker and the butler. The baker is bread, and the butler talks about wine. So we've got bread and wine, the elements of the Lord's Supper. We'll talk about all that next in chapter 40. So we'll see you next time.